And so you will be able to get the recording as well as the slides afterwards. So don't worry about that. Also, keep in mind that evaluation is really, really important so that we can continue to bring trainings and information that are going to help us all do this work better. So we really do ask that at the end you fill out a short evaluation survey, which will be emailed to you after the workshop. Fill it out, use that to give us your input. So again, we can continue to improve our content. Last but not least, like I said, the slides and everything will be sent to you afterwards, and we are going to record and we are recording. So now it is my honor and pleasure to introduce you to our West Center Director, Jenn Marshall, who will be hosting our training today.
Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm so happy to see everybody's faces and names on the screen, and really excited to be giving this presentation today. So I'm Jen. I'm newer to the Family Justice Center. I've been here about 3 months at our West Center, and I come from a background of working as an advocate, as a SART advocate, and working at a rape crisis center for 8 years and as a volunteer. So this is a topic that I've always been really passionate about, and that I try to create a presentation that's interactive and that calls on the collective wisdom of the room, as well as, some things that I've learned in my time doing this work. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get us started. All right, can everybody see my slides? Everything looking good? Awesome. All right, so these were our objectives for today. So we're gonna be going over defining sexual violence as an umbrella term, identifying myths and assumptions about sexual violence and the people who experience, identify the impacts of sexual violence, and describe how to respond and support someone who has experienced sexual violence. So hopefully by the end of this training, you all will have the answers to all of this and feel confident when a survivor comes to you and is looking for support. And then you can continue your learning on how to further support them. So to start off, I do want to give a content warning for this first part, or content note that, we will be talking about some direct forms of violence. So I always say during this topic that things can come up. It's a difficult topic to talk about. So please take care of yourself during this presentation as feels good to you. And what I mean by sexual violence is an umbrella term. I have my little umbrella here, is that oftentimes when we think of sexual violence, automatically we think only of sexual assault, or rape. And really, when we think about sexual violence, there's a whole lot of behaviors that fall under this umbrella. And so we define it by any non-consensual sexual behavior that does not require physical contact. So I want you to keep that in mind. And what I'm going to do next is we're going to put you out into some breakout rooms, 4 to 5 people, and we'll put these questions in the chat. And I'll just ask that you discuss with your groups. What are some examples of sexual violence that don't involve physical contact? What are some examples of sexual violence that involves physical contacts? What are some examples of tactics or ways that people enact sexual violence? And what are some examples of relationships in which sexual violence can occur? So I want you to kind of discuss this amongst your groups. And then when we come back, what I'll do is I'll open it up to whoever wants to speak as we kind of work through this and, talk about this form of violence. So I'll go ahead. Any questions about what we're doing?
I don't see any. I think we're ready to break out.
Perfect. All right, Janice, we'll get us started with that.
I'm gonna go join a room. I'm looking to see which room I wanna join.
Perfect.
Hmm, who do I wanna meet? Oh, most people join their room. Hmm, okay. Emily, maybe I wanna go. Oh, Ellie, I'll go to their room.
Hey, Janice, you got the time that they went in there, right?
Oh, yeah. I
Okay,
think it's at
perfect.
least been like maybe 1 minute, so I'm gonna start it at 5.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I clocked it at like 10:11. So
Okay, cool. All right. Have it going.
welcome everybody. We're just in some breakout rooms right now, so we'll get back in a moment.
All right, we got about 45 seconds and I'll be bringing them back in.
Perfect. Thank you, Denise.
All right, here they come.
Welcome back, everyone. Six more seconds, then we'll get started. All right. Well, welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed just talking a little bit with each other, getting ready. So what I want to do is just first start off with this
Gotta go back.
question. What are some examples of sexual violence that don't involve physical contact? And what I'm going to do is, because we're a large group, is I'm going to try to get at least 3 to 4 people who want to share a little bit of what they talked about on each of these points. So who would like to start us off?
I can start us off. My name is Gabriela. So I was in group 4, and so we were thinking about sexual violence that does not involve physical contact, and we thought about the pictures, that sometimes they send to a boyfriend, and then that kind of stuff. Talk about it like this. Well, I'm going to do this to you, and you kind of feel uncomfortable, exposing themselves to us. So those are 3 we came up. I don't know if there's any more out there, but those are 3 that we came up with.
Great. Thank you for sharing. I see, Ricky, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ricky Lynn. I'm from Hope Solutions, a probation case manager. And we didn't have enough time. It's like we gotta go back. You guys gotta give us a little bit more time. But no, Dahlia was in a pride, say, because I am a survivor of rape, and we were getting ready to get into it, and said Dahlia had some really good information. And we just didn't have enough time. We did. But I'm here for the long haul today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I saw that. Anybody else want to share on, oh, I see showing porn to someone, cyber stalking, sexual harassment. Exactly. So you all get, that when we're talking about sexual violence, it's not just physical violence. There's also ways that sexual violence is enacted emotionally, mentally, in some of the elements that you all talked about. My next question was, what are some examples of sexual violence that does involve physical contact? And I know Ricky shared one, so rape, sexual assault is definitely one. Who would like to share, something else? Sex trafficking. See, withholding physical contact.
Forcing someone to touch you.
Yes, forcing someone to touch you. And that is a really important point to bring up, because a lot of the times with a lot of male survivors, they were forced to do an act, a sexual act. And so with that, there can become this stigma of like, if sexual assault isn't penetrative, or if it's not being enacted on somebody with by somebody else's body, that makes it less less harmful, and that's simply not true. So thank you for bringing that up. Peeping toms, exactly. So these are some great examples. What did you all talk about in terms of tactics to enact sexual violence? What are the ways that people can commit it? What are the tools they use to commit violence?
Can I go again, or
Yeah,
somebody else?
absolutely.
Okay, so we talk about bribing,
Mhm.
threatening, blackmailing, um, violence. They says, if you don't do this, I'm gonna beat you up or whatever, right?
Mhm.
Coercion. So those are the ones that we came up.
Great. And I see Serene put in the chat grooming. Serene, I don't know if you'd want to explain that to us, just for folks who might not know what that means.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Serene. Grooming is basically getting the mindset to change into what they want. So I'll just use an example. Oh, I'll be your boyfriend. I'll help you buying shoes. And so, unfortunately, the vulnerability, they tap onto that, and they become their best friend, buying them food and everything. And so the victim begins to feel, oh, you're my friend, you're here to help me, and that is grooming. And so, when in reality, they're basically cohorting them to do what they want. And so, grooming is pretty much the first thing I have seen with my clients is it's like a trap to me, it's setting up a trap.
Exactly. And we see it. Thank you for sharing that. That was
You're welcome.
a great way to explain that. And we see that a lot in child sexual abuse, and in human trafficking, child sexual exploitation, and other instances too, like in intimate partner violence and things like that. So it's a very important concept to bring up. And then I see here manipulation. Social media has definitely been a tool to enact. Great, you all have this down. The next question I asked are, what are some relationships in which sexual violence can occur? What did you all talk about in terms of that?
Can I go again?
Yeah, absolutely.
Any relationship, literally, husband and wife, neighbors, any like cousins, fathers, teacher, student, boss, employees, or any type of relationship.
Exactly. So you identified this was kind of a trick question on my part. Sexual violence can occur in any relationship. And oftentimes, the relationship of the survivor to the person who caused harm can influence how they feel about what happened, how those impacts show up. For example, if it's somebody who is maybe in their family that they love and that they care about, who has harmed them. Oftentimes survivors are then, well, do I, access, in terms of response to sexual violence, do I go and I try to get legal remedies, but I don't want this person to be harmed. I don't want this person in jail. I want them, in my life because I care about them. And at the same time, there's this harm that I've experienced, and I need some sort of accountability or healing from that. And so oftentimes as counselors, we're kind of sitting in that gray area of, what feels best to you? What is going to help get you closer to restoration? And really just taking the time to not force somebody into a certain direction, but just sit there and listen and hold the container so that way they can have informed choice and support in how they move forward. And that gives back, you know, a little bit of empowerment, of choice that was often taken away when somebody experiences sexual violence. And I see here, you know, authority figures, that also is a huge dynamic, right? Like we see that in workplaces and institutions, you know, all sorts of areas. So again, another dynamic. If somebody is assaulted by someone who is their boss, who controls their wages, then they might, you know, not know how to proceed because they need this money for this job, and now they've experienced this harm. So what do I do, right? And I think that's just important to think about as we move forward, and as you're supporting survivors, is looking at what is this, who is this person that harmed them to the survivor? What is their relationship to them, and how is that impacting their current state and how they feel they can move forward? So great job, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. All right. And so this is just kind of a quick wrap up of what we talked about. You know, there are things on here that I thought of when I was making this presentation, but a lot of you touched on this. So we you know, touched on a lot of this. You know, the other thing I want to point out is also how like our attitudes and beliefs kind of set the stage to sexual violence, and we'll talk a little bit more deeply about that today as well. And then, you know, we definitely talked about, you know, some of the physical contacts, and you know, someone also mentioned being forced to have sex or to touch somebody else. So that touched on that point. The other thing I wanted to bring up is ritual abuse, because it's often not talked about. And ritual abuse is a form of abuse that often happens repeatedly, and this can happen over time. So it can be a ritual of time, or it can be a ritual to how the abuse was enacted to the person. And oftentimes it is repeated. There's extreme forms of abuse. There's extreme manipulation involved. And so a lot of ritual abuse survivors can go years experiencing abuse. And then when they finally leave that has a long lasting impact on them. So something else to think about in terms of supporting survivors. And we talked a lot of this about how, so coercion, manipulation, threat, drug or alcohol facilitated assault is huge. And oftentimes I will say when drugs or alcohol, or if there's been a lapse in memory of survivors, there can be a lot of shame that comes with that. You know, and we'll talk about shame a little bit later, but, you know, this feeling that I am wrong or I have caused this because I didn't do that. And one of the things I always like to say is the consequence to drinking over, you know, drinking beyond your mental capacity is a hangover. The consequence to drinking is not sexual violence. And a lot of survivors really need to hear that, because oftentimes, you know, even just in our society, we can say like, if somebody used substances, you put yourself in this position, and nobody puts themselves in that position. Harm is caused by somebody who chooses to enact harm. And then we have physical force and the absence of yes and disregard of no. And then we talked about this pretty thoroughly. You know, there is the myth that sexual violence is only committed by strangers or hiding in a bush in our society, and that's simply not the case. Most sexual violence is happening by somebody the survivor knows, cares about, and even loves. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on is just institutional, structural, and state sanctioned sexual violence. Because I think oftentimes when we think of sexual violence, we solely think about those interpersonal dynamics. And there's a lot of ways that the institution, our state laws, you know, our history in the United States has kind of set the foundation for sexual violence to occur. And so some of the ways that this has shown up historically is through human trafficking and colonization, you know, in enslavement, how, you know, sexual violence was used as a tool to further that. We also see it in hate crimes. So there's a hate crime called the LGBTQ plus panic defense, which is a legal strategy where if somebody, you know, maybe finds out that someone they're dating is transgender, or they didn't think that their gender matched what they perceived it as, and they find out they're trans and they kill them or they harm them, then that's a legal defense that they can use to say that's excusable. You know, and what this does is it really furthers homophobia and transphobia to really, you know, persuade a jury into acquitting the defendant so they can't take action, they can't take accountability for you know, the act that they did to the queer person. And then we also have medical. So one of the you know, most you know, horrific kind of, I mean, not most horrific, I wouldn't say, but just one horrific act that has occurred medically is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which was done on Black men who, you know, they wanted to do a study to find out how syphilis occurred in Black people. And they basically took 600 men who were enrolled in this study. And of this group, they had a number of people who had syphilis and a number of people who didn't. And even though they had the treatment, they developed the treatment throughout the study, they purposely did not give that, did not tell these folks that they were being even studied, and also use manipulation by having offering medical care, insurance, rides to and from clinics, meals, things like that, to make sure that they would stay in this experiment, causing a lot of Black men to die, to further that research. We also see this with forced sterilization. We see this in prisons. So that's an example of an institution. So sexual abuse of inmates. So correctional officers using their position of power to enact abuse. And then mental health and conversion therapy. So this is an idea, again, in the LGBTQ plus community, where if somebody feels that, you know, that is inappropriate to be LGBTQ plus, they would actually send them away to camps, to psychotherapists who would convert them to being straight. And oftentimes they would use sexual violence to do that. So these are just some examples of institutions and state sanctioned. Obviously, there are many, many more that we could talk about. We could almost do a whole training on this entirely. You know, it shows up in college campuses, religious institutions, things like that. And I think, you know, for a lot of survivors, especially if they're experiencing it in this way, it can cause not only this, the impact of the trauma itself, but also the impact of, you know, an institution or maybe something that somebody believed in as a net of safety or a net of learning, enacting that violence, and how that must feel to and change that person's worldview afterwards. I just want to pause and just make sure there's any questions. I see some things. Oh, thank you, Janice, for clarifying. Intentional, exactly. Perfect, thank you. All right. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is something that often came up for me when I was working on the hotline or responding to survivors who were coming forward and saying that they had an experience, is oftentimes they would ask, was this sexual assault? Is this sexual assault? Does this count as sexual assault, right? Because we have this way of scaling harm and you know, trying to define, you know, what what counts and what doesn't in our society. And so this is the federal definition. The term sexual assault means any non-consensual sexual act prescribed by federal, tribal, or state laws, including when the victim lacks capacity to consent. And that was by OVW in 2019. And then I have linked here, the California Penal Code 261. I'm not going to go over that because it's a very, very long code and it isn't necessarily, important to this. But what I want to ask you is, how do you think this fits into answering this question? Do you think that the federal definition, the penal code definition, can answer this question of was this sexual assault? How would you answer this if somebody came forward? .261 is a great definition. Okay, great. All right. Well, and here's what I often think about, right? So we have legal definitions of sexual assault or sexual violence, different terms, right? And then we also have the interpersonal act. And so sometimes, for instance, we might have a survivor who comes to us and is like, hey, I don't know if this counts as assault last night. There's this person I was involved with who took me to their house and they repeatedly asked me to have sex. I said no at first. I kept saying no. And then eventually I just got tired of them asking. I was feeling uncomfortable, so I gave in. Is this sexual assault, right? And what I often want to do before I go into the legal definition is talk about what that act meant to that person. Where do you feel like your boundaries were crossed in here? What is your understanding of what sexual assault means? Where is your hesitancy? Where's this questioning coming from? And really put it back to how they're defining their experience. Because at the core, for me, especially as somebody who was a sexual assault counselor, we want to define sexual assault by the experience of survivors who went through that, right? Now, what I always say is the legal system is a tool, right? It's a tool for accountability that survivors can use to try to get safety, to try to get support, and to try to get accountability. However, it does not always, going through a legal process doesn't always end with a survivor getting that. And oftentimes if somebody goes through a case, goes to court, they've used these legal definitions and that case is dismissed, or it doesn't, they choose not to prosecute it, or, maybe the police officer doesn't take the report because they don't think that it counts, then that can leave survivors feeling like their experience didn't matter, and that and add to this feeling of, okay, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I caused this, and more confusion. And so what I always do is I start by believing, because I always say that in terms of support, I'm here to support the person, right? And then the legal system can decide what it wants to do with this situation. And the result of that legal system does not make this experience any less valid, does not make this experience any less impactful. So that's just something I want us to keep in mind as we're talking to people who might have this question. And then sometimes the legal definition can also be a tool, right? You can say, like, here's here are some of the elements that you know, the law would use to describe this. How does this match with your experience? Is there anything that's not included in this? And really hold that conversation with the survivor.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're kind of heading into myths and assumptions. The first thing I want to ask you is, what are qualities that the believable victim has? And when I say believable, I don't mean somebody who you would personally believe. I mean, in our society, what are some associations or qualities that we think of when we think of somebody who has been victimized by sexual assault? You know, and one thing, just to kind of start us off, is one thing I've had people share in the past is it's somebody who reports right away, right? They experience the assault, they go straight to the police, and they move on that, and that makes them more believable. But what else shows up in this question? Evidence, yes. If there's medical confirmation, yes. And oftentimes there isn't evidence or medical confirmation that can happen for survivors. Ongoing situations, so if it's been repeated. Anything else? They tell right away, yep. Mental health, right? You know, we have huge stigma around people with mental health diagnoses who experience assault at higher levels, and people with disabilities who experience it at higher levels, but because they might have mental health symptoms that are agitated as a result of the trauma, then they are less believable. Or if they have a history of mental health symptoms, they might also be engaging with systems that have already denied them care and already see them a certain way. Age definitely plays into it. We have this concept in society that only young people from the ages of 18 to 25 are assaulted because we attach it to our ideas around beauty, right? Oh, people who speak clearly and eloquently. Exactly. Who have descriptions of the abuse. History of the perpetrator, suicidal ideations, consistency in telling their story. Definitely. I remember I was in a conference once, and they showed us an old police manual that had said, you know, put it out, like how to tell if the victim is lying. And one of them was if they, you know, jump around, or they can't answer questions right, or they remember things later on. And really that's an impact of trauma. When you experience assault, your memory is impacted. And so you might remember that in bits and pieces. You might not be able to recall exactly what happened. And so sometimes that can add to that. Yes, if they have restraining orders. Exactly. You all are definitely on it. An alibi or a lack of alibi. Absolutely. Thank you. The other thing I wanted to ask about is, what are associations that people have with the word victim and survivor? And what I mean by that is, in our society, who do we define as a victim? Let's start there. What are those associations? And one thing that's been said in the past is, you know, a victim is often somebody who is destroyed, right? They're you know, at their lowest. They're at their most vulnerable. But what else might be there? Someone who suffers violence. Yep. So there's an element of suffering. Someone who has no hope, shame. Exactly. I see anyone who is a victim of crime. Absolutely. PTS, unable to help themselves. Exactly. Guilt. Yep. Lost. feeling sorry for themselves. Yes, this is all great. And the thing is, there's elements of this that are the impacts of sexual violence, right? Um, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but what are some words that we have associated with a survivor? What does being a survivor mean? What does that mean to our society if somebody says, I am a survivor? Strength, resilience, hope. Yep. Overcame. Standing up for yourself. Brave, strong. Yes. Taking back your control. Great. Fighter, warrior. Great, great. So, kind of thinking a phoenix rising from your lowest. So kind of thinking about these words, victim and survivors. And I know, the word victim is often used in the legal system purposely, right? It helps tell a story to the jury. It helps put a frame of reference to the jury. And then there's survivor, which has been used in a lot of sexual violence advocacy to have that empowerment, right? And to have kind of a reclamation of, kind of transforming this harm in overcoming it. And, none of this is wrong. None of this is bad. And what sometimes happens with survivors are people who experience violence is this can almost become a container for their experience. It can almost become a box to them. So that way they feel like they either have to be a victim or a survivor. There's no gray area in between. I'm either weak or I'm strong. I'm either broken or I'm healed, right? And I think sometimes when I've supported people who've experienced sexual violence, is this can feel like they're trapped. They're trapped in those definitions, and that they don't have space to feel how they feel. And one thing I like to say is I'm a survivor myself, and I use that term sometimes. But there's also days that I do feel broken still. I am still crying. I am still feeling weak. And when we think about this kind of binary of victim and survivor, we want to expand that to say, even when you're feeling weak, that is a strength. When the way you're moving through this, there is strength in that. And so, what I always like to bring up for people is letting people, especially in our direct work, letting them name it for themselves, not telling them, oh, you're a survivor, you're going to get through this, because somebody might not be in the space to accept that quite yet. They might still feel like they don't have a name for themselves around this experience. And it almost kind of makes people feel like they have to be on a pedestal, that they have to be a super survivor in order to be valid, in order to be healed. And really, when I talk about healing or reclamation, it's a journey, it's a process, and it looks a lot of different ways. And I really like this quote that says, it's a conundrum. If you survive it, then the trauma can't have been that bad. It was terrible. It was so awful. There was no way I could survive. What did this child die of? Shame, mainly, and narrative necessity. So just some food for thought. And really what we're talking about is rape culture. How our culture has prevailing social attitudes that have the effect of normalizing or trivializing sexual assault and abuse. And this can be built from our attitudes and beliefs. So with that, a foundation of racism, colonialism, sexism, homophobia, and ableism. So some of these things that we've talked about in terms of how you know, we think about those who experience violence. And then that leads the stage for the normalization of violence, which also leads the stage for the removal of bodily autonomy. So the right to your own body. And then how that sets the stage for more physical expressions of violence. And this isn't meant to scale these harms in any way, because trauma kind of doesn't differentiate. You know, trauma has an impact, and our bodies respond to it and our brains respond to it. And like, this is why oftentimes when we're talking about things like rape jokes, when we're talking about things like victim blaming or, you know, objectification and things like that, we call it rape culture, because it sets this stage for these more physical expressions of violence. So I'd love to hear, you know, just few examples from folks on, you know, what are some examples of rape culture that you have seen? And I said one already. Yep, we have victim blaming, excusing language as locker room talk. She got herself in that situation. Oh, shaming the way we dress, humanizing the abuser and dehumanizing the victim. She was asking for it. Exactly. Dress codes, the people we associate with, yes. So if you hang around that crowd, you're kind of asking for it. Exactly. They wanted it. She has the power to ruin his life. The environment, boys will be boys. Absolutely. So you all have an understanding of this. And got in that car with a total stranger. So what it's doing is it's taking away the you know, the accountability from the person who caused harm and putting it on the person who experienced that harm. Oh, dirty. Yes. So thank you for sharing those examples. Blaming clothing, lifestyle, habits, and other irrelevant things. Absolutely. And the thing I always talk about with this, sometimes I include like a slide on, you know, things that we use to prevent sexual violence. So things like rape whistles. There's even been things that can identify like drugs and drinks and things like that. And these can be great tools. I'm not saying they're not they're not valid in that. A lot of survivors have created those things to keep themselves safe. And when I think about preventing sexual violence, I think about what are the ways we as a society are preventing sexual violence? Like why is it that it's the targets of violence who have to come up with these ways to kind of dodge it or escape it, and instead we're not talking about what are these root causes, right? Like what is at the foundation of this, and how do we change that? And I see here we have buddy systems, awareness, today's training. Thank you. Yes, exactly. And, you know, things like buddy systems can be like a physical safety measure, right? But today's training might, you know, oftentimes when I'm giving this training, what I'm hoping to do is kind of dismantle some of these myths and assumptions and get people thinking about, you know, how can we all prevent sexual violence? Not just people who experience it, but people who cause it, people who support people who experience, and amongst our community. And so, you know, the opposite of this rape culture is a consent culture. So this is a definition of consent I love from Stacey Haynes' Survivor's Guide to Sex, which was written to talk about kind of reclaiming sexuality after child sexual abuse. And it says, consent is the ability to choose based on your own internal experience what you want physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, sexually, and then to communicate those wants. And for consent to exist, it must be clear. So they must be clear to what they're consenting to. The person must be conscious, physically conscious, continuous. So, if you consent to one thing, that doesn't mean that that stands, for all time, and free from coercion. And I think sometimes in consent, we tend to think about it only in terms of sexuality, but really we practice consent all day. I'm in my office right now, my door's closed, I have a sign on there saying meeting in progress, right? And so if somebody needed something and they knocked on my door, they're asking for my consent in a way, right? Like they're saying, can I come in? Can I invite you in? And then it's my choice to invite them in or not. Now, the difference between that is if somebody's like barging in my door, and there might be a time where that's okay, but that doesn't mean that it's always okay, right? So, there are ways that we practice this every single day. And I think when we talk about creating a consent culture, yeah, exposure to positive relationships and consent early on in a consistent manner. Kids should be taught consent and given the ability to invoke consent in their own lives. I love that, Jessica. And that is an important form of prevention, because when you teach kids, youth, people who may not have gotten that message that they have a right to their autonomy, to their body, to these different elements of consent, then we, in a way, we kind of set the stage for violence. And so as I'm talking about consent, why do you think this is especially important for those who have experienced sexual violence? And really what I would love to focus on, actually, because I think you get that first question, is how do you think you can invite consent into your work, like into our everyday practices? How can we practice this as service providers, as friends, as family members, with survivors? And one example I always like to use is, when I used to go to the hospital to help somebody through an investigation process, when I walked in, first, of course, I would ask them if it was okay if I could be there, which is a form of consent, but I would also ask them, where would you like me to sit right now? So just giving that choice of how much physical distance do you want between me and you? Asking permission to touch, embrace, comfort, absolutely. Set boundaries and ask about boundaries, absolutely. What else? We have consent forms, right? Here's what you can expect during our time working together. Here might be the impacts of that. Do you consent to this, right? Yes, confidentiality and any limitations, things like mandated reporting, right? For a lot of youth, um, who may be talking to somebody who's a mandated reporter about it, sometimes it can feel like they weren't able to consent to the process that can come after that, because they're now have disclosed something trying to get support, but then they're pulled into this process that is meant to help and help keep them safe, but can emotionally feel like they don't have control over their own kind of destiny in that. And so when you're a mandated reporter, letting them know, like, hey, this is what this means. I want you to know, like, if you disclose XYZ to me, that I will have to report that. Given that, how can we continue in this conversation? I see recognizing body language and facial expressions. Exactly. Oftentimes in work with survivors, it can be hard to say no after you've had that ignored, and have been harmed as a result of that, even sometimes. So that shows up in our work all the time. So recognizing when a no might not be, or a yes might not be a yes, and asking again, And calling attention, like I hear you're saying yes right now, and I'm seeing your body, kind of fold over, and you look a little bit nervous, and I just want to check in. Are you really okay with this? Transparency, be present, and a good listener. Absolutely. All right. So now I want to go into some impacts of sexual violence. And so I love this image. I used it a lot when I would train advocates on responding to the hospital, because I think often after somebody experiences sexual violence, it's kind of like, and this is how I think of advocacy in general, or just support in general, is afterwards they have all these arrows pointing them different ways, right? We have society, we have family, we have their own thoughts and feelings about what sexual violence means and what that means they should do. And so it can kind of feel like, where do I go? It can feel like this twisted maze of, okay, there's all these arrows and I don't know where to turn, right? And when I think of support for survivors, what we want to do is open up that road directly to them. Where do you want to go? Yes, all these roads exist. Yes, they're there. And given that, what do you want to do? How can I help you support what would feel best for you in this moment? And in addition to that, oftentimes people are thinking, we already talked about, was this sexual violence? But then there might be safety concerns if that person lives with them. Maybe they're, work in their building. Maybe they go to school with them. Health concerns, so like the physical impacts of that, both before and after. Whether to tell anyone. So should I disclose this to somebody? You know, will I be helped if I disclose this to somebody? I mean, even at the hospital, sometimes it was, that person started off their day and ended up at the hospital, and now their kid is in childcare. So how do I handle this if I'm in this hospital? I have to stay here. I have to pick up my kids. How do I deal with that situation without telling them what exactly happened? Whether to report or not, physical needs, and more, right? Like there's things like immigration that impacts people. There's things around like violence that they might experience from the systems that they, think about turning to in terms of support. And I think really when it comes to supporting survivors, what we want to do is kind of try to slow things down and try to sit with them and talk about these things, and kind of funnel into, this concept of like, what do you need? Okay. So this is also, a little bit of an acronym that I loved to use in my counting around the impacts of sexual violence, because oftentimes the impacts of sexual violence just mirror, it has some of its own unique experiences, and it mirrors a lot of what the impacts of trauma are in general. So these might be behavioral impacts, so habits, actions, and so what we see with that is oftentimes, people will have a startled reaction, they'll have restlessness, they'll have sleep and appetite disturbances, they might have difficulty expressing themselves, they may be more argumentative, right? Because now they had this situation where they felt really disempowered, and so they're trying to gain that back. Or that feeling of anger towards the person who caused harm can bleed into our interaction as support people. So thinking about if somebody's sitting in front of me and they're argumentative, maybe this is due to what they experienced. They also might avoid event reminders. They might, have a decrease in activity level. They might start engaging in just high risk behaviors or increase their use of substances or withdraw. And what I say is like, this is a wide net of reactions, and it's going to depend on the person. And when you're talking to someone, what has often helped me is to say, how is what you're experiencing now different from how you were before this happened, right? How have your behaviors changed? How is your use of substances different now that you've experienced sexual violence, right? And that can not, one, help support, but also help inform me of where that person was at before and why that's different and what could possibly help with that. There's also affect, so feelings, emotions, responses to stimulation. So this can be numbness, detachment, anxiety, intense fear, guilt, anger, helplessness. We already talked a lot about shame, depersonalization, which is a term that means feeling as if you're watching yourself. So I've had it described as like your head's kind of up a balloon up top, and you're kind of seeing your body go through these actions, and you don't feel connected to that. And then there's also things like feeling out of control. There's even a sense of denial sometimes. Vulnerability. Exactly. Speaking in the third person. Great shares, Serene. And then there's somatic. So there's bodily, physical responses, right? There can be nausea. There can be, stomach upset, sweating, shivering, muscle tremors, sleep disturbances, an increased focus on body aches and pain. Like sometimes that's just a result from the mental anguish that they're feeling. Appetite changes, lower resistance to colds and infections, persistent fatigue, hyperarousal, so feeling like you're always on edge, you always have to know what's going on. And then there's interpersonal impacts, so how relationships, intimacy, and boundaries are impacted. Maybe there's intrusive thoughts now while they're being intimate. Maybe they're having, their relationships are suffering because they're withdrawing. Exactly, fear of people. Maybe they're afraid to connect with people, right? Maybe it can go a lot of different ways, right? Like maybe they're withdrawing from those closest to them, but also maybe they're leaning and expect those closest to them to fix everything, because they feel that sense of helplessness. And then there's cognitive, so thoughts, memory, rationale, goals, capacity to plan, decision making. So they might replay the event over and over again. Time can feel unreal. The event might feel like it's happening in slow motion. We already talked a little bit about memory problems that are results, right? So either being able to recall what happened, being able to put that in a direct timeline, and also the way that, when somebody goes into a room that they were assaulted in, and then automatically they're thinking of that assault, or they smell something, and then it brings them back to that place. And then, of course, like when we're talking about goals, capacity to plan, and decision making, oftentimes in the response to sexual violence, we're asking a lot of people to do that, right? Like, what do you want to do next? And there's very real things that people have to figure out for their own safety oftentimes. And when the brain is impacted by trauma, this prefrontal cortex, the top of our brain, can feel like it's disconnected. And so sometimes people might need help and support, setting smaller goals so they can reach them, talking more about decision making. They might need reminders, right? Like working with survivors, oftentimes, we would have folks who would be like, oh, I'm so sorry, I just forgot to come, right? I forgot to come to this appointment. I had this going on. And oftentimes that's because they're still kind of in that fog mentally. And so thinking about, not only how do we support that interpersonally, but within our agencies, how do we meet these impacts and put, consider them in our practices. And then there's also spirituality. So the way that worldview, religion, culture, traditions, especially if it's a case where somebody may have experienced sexual violence in their church. What does that mean for their concept of their own religion? Um, a lot of the time survivors would share, like, this feels like a betrayal of God, like, or my church is telling me that I'm wrong because I did this, right? And so thinking about, like, how is this disrupting their worldview? So I like to use basics to kind of think about all those different ways that people are impacted, but it also can be a tool when you're meeting with somebody to kind of sort out where they're at too. So sometimes when I would talk to somebody on the phone, like in crisis counseling, especially if I only had about 20 minutes with them, I would listen and I would kind of think about, okay, where is what they're sharing landing? Like if they're telling me, oh, like, I don't feel as close to my boyfriend anymore. We I have him sleeping in a different room. I, am scared to go outside or engage. I might look at that and I might be like, okay, like it sounds like, there's some of your habits that have been impacted by this, and some of your interpersonal relationships. So it can be a way to funnel into those most immediate impacts and then name that for the survivor and help them work through that. Any questions or thoughts on this before I go on? Great. So I'd love to hear in the chat, like given kind of all this information I've talked about today, these impacts, the way sexual violence showed up, what are your ideas on how you support someone who has disclosed sexual violence? What do you do? Listen. Yes. Be patient. No judgment. Oh, I'm loving these. Be knowledgeable. Yes. Ask them how I can support them. Ding, ding, ding. Definitely important place to start, right? Like, what would feel most supportive in this moment? Be supportive. Yes. Keep your appointments. Yes. Consistency, follow through. Empathy. Showing up. Do not compare to others. Yes, everyone has their own unique experience. Checking up on them. Exactly. Like they might not always call you when they need help. It can be hard to reach out for help. So when you're a service provider, thinking about like, I haven't heard from this person in a while. Maybe I should call them and just check in just to see how they're doing. Be ready for change. Build that trust. Yeah. And trust is a process, right? Like I always like to say, or I don't know who actually said this, but move at the speed of trust, right? We can't demand trust from somebody, especially when their trust has been severely impacted. So realizing that the survivor might not trust you, and that's okay. They get to not trust you. What we can do is be consistent and show up in an authentic way, and that'll build the trust. That connection will build the trust. Ask if they need anything. Absolutely. And yeah, these are just some things that I like to say. So listen, validate, believe, right? Believe survivors. Empower, so mirror their language, right? And this kind of goes back to what I was talking to you about, defining somebody's experience, right? Like if somebody comes to you and is like, I think my boundary was crossed here, or I'm not sure how to name that. Was this sexual assault? Taking a moment to just sit in that not knowing before offering, sit in that conversation so that way they can come to that. Avoid advice giving, right? And this can be tricky as service providers because we want to give information, we want to let people proceed how they want. Sometimes our advice isn't always going to be applicable to the person we're working with. Sometimes we might have a different view of what they might need for support than they actually need. So thinking about how do we ask questions and listen and help them identify what is the next best step. Don't take it personal. Yes, exactly. I love that, Serene. That is so important in this work. Affirm their right to proceed however they want. It is your choice. You know, and in you know, sexual violence, there are laws in place that do allow for that choice. Avoiding why questions. And what I mean by this is, why were you there? Why did this, you know, why did this happen? Because when we hear why, sometimes it can feel like a judgment, right? And so thinking more about like how, what, like let's explore this. Clarifying questions might be needed, right? If somebody is coming to me and they're like, where do I report this? Or where do I go to? I might need to know like, okay, where did this happen at? Okay, so it's in this city. You know, what are you thinking of doing? Oh, you want to connect to police. Okay, well, here's how you can get that information. And then curiosity questions should be avoided. And what I mean by this is we don't need necessarily the narrative of their experience all the time to provide them support. So, you know, I would really focus on the impacts, the feelings, where they're at, and avoid asking them more about the incident, right? We don't need to know more about the incident. And also, I would say in curiosity questions, if somebody is a different culture, if somebody has a different life experience than you, not using your work with them to inform yourself of that. Like for me, as a queer person, there's times where, I mean, even when I've called AT&T and they're like, what is a non-binary? What is, you know, what is this? And I'm like, I just really want to fix my cable right now, right? I don't really want to necessarily go into my identities and cultures with you. I want support. And so if you are curious about, you know, the culture of somebody or their life experience, like, you know, do that research, like go on Google, read some books, listen to media, but don't put that on the survivor to teach you about who they are. It's not an investigation, it's support confirmation, and concentrate on how survivors feel. Exactly. And really staying in the moment. It can be easy to jump ahead as service providers because our brains are kind of thinking about, okay, how can I support? How can I put this into place so I can get them closer, right? And is that important in this moment with this survivor? What does this survivor need in this moment? They need connection. They need that empathy. They need to be heard and they need to be believed. Everything else we can work on, right? And then I like to think of, I always say crisis counseling because that's my background, but even these support conversations, when somebody's coming to you in a high state of crisis, it's kind of like a mental health emergency room. You're like, you know, going ahead of that will bring them ahead of that. So that's why staying in the moment is so important. What do you need in this moment? And then safety planning. And I think sometimes when we think of safety planning, we can think of, you know, like lethality assessments, and we can get really big and kind of prescriptive with it. But also sometimes it can be a conversation. It can be, okay, you know, you are afraid of going home right now. Are there other places you can stay today? Okay, there's not. Here are some resources that I have. What of these feel good, right? And just sticking to what can get that person to the closest to safer that we can get, right? Because safety planning in itself isn't a catch-all. And it isn't a guarantee. Oftentimes it's harm reduction. And yeah, that's my my presentation for today. Any questions? I like to leave a little bit of time at the end to make sure, if there's any thoughts or if anything you want clarified. Yeah, just open it up. Oh, thank you, Serene. All right.
Jean,
Oh,
I had just a comment.
yeah.
I also noticed too you referred back to the SART team. I too was on the SART team for about 6 years with Bay War. That was and also where I received my crisis certification, and still continuing to do that today, but with the exception of SART. But I recall SART is if anyone is really interested in this field, definitely SART is raw. It's you can't plan for that. We can't study for that because we're in it. You're there. You're basically thrown into the water, and you have again. It's a feeling that you have. You have to have that feeling to be there for that person because they're totally lost,
Exactly.
just gone. It's everything that you have spoke about. And SART, for those, it's a sexual assault response team. And we're together, we're teamed up with the law enforcement as well as a nurse. And so we respond, and that's why it's called a response team. We're the first ones to be there for our survivor. And sometimes you hold hands, and
Mm-hmm.
we have to be careful not to vicariously get into that. So definitely a a job, or I should say a passion. I'm going to call it a passion. If this is really where you want to go, there's so much more that we can do as a society for not just ourselves, but others, because for what I feel, I'm just one event away from being a survivor myself. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you, Serene. And I see a question, how do you handle having to make a mandated report if the person who is a victim does not want the report to be made? And that's tricky, right? Because we are bound by law in those cases. And what I always say is try to give them as much choice in that process as you can. Hey, I do have to report this. Hopefully you've informed them before that you're a mandated reporter. And, kind of given that, here's what that process looks like. Now, I could make this call, or if you want, you could make this call. Here's are some things that you might go to. Like, here are some resources that might help you as you're pulled. Exactly, I see that in there, in there too, in the chat too. Here are some resources that might be a support to you as you're in this process. And then just naming, like, I know that this because I have to report this, it might be taking away your choice. And I want to know that I take that seriously. And like, this is my role. And it comes from a place of being concerned for your health and safety. And, knowing that they might have a reaction to that and being okay with that. Exactly. Offering to make that call together. Great question. Oh, thank you, Ellie. Any other questions? Perfect.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, we want to thank you guys so much for joining us for another Family Justice Institute training. As I said at the beginning, we will be sending you the slides as well as the recording for this shortly. And on behalf of Jen, Susan, and the rest of Family Justice Center, we appreciate you and we wish you all a happy weekend.